What you're not lucky about, though, is this idea that being spouted by our Defence Secretary Grant Shapps that the UK is increasingly vulnerable to the threat of missile and drone attacks following decades of cuts. Let's just jump straight into this story with Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, OBE, former British Army colonel, and find out what's really going on and how vulnerable we are indeed. Hamish, I mean, I'm someone who sort of has a curious interest in geopolitics and also in weapons of war. I don't know why. I'm an odd form of a girl. But this alarms me when I read this. When you look at where we are in the world now, wars of attrition, fought on soil, fought in the air, very much back in business. Is it the case that we've just been not giving our defence sector enough money or buying all the wrong sorts of things?
Well, I think it's a combination, Alex, but you're right. I mean, the threats at the moment to this country have never been higher since the end of the Cold War. And it's since the end of the Cold War that we've sort of paid lip service to our defence. We've cut our defence spending from about 5% down to 2%. And hence we have a very hollowed out military. At the same time, we've got Putin attacking in Ukraine. And nobody thinks that Putin will stop at Ukraine if he prevails. And if he goes beyond Ukraine, that'll involve NATO. That will involve us. And when Putin looks at the UK at the moment and looks at our conventional defence, it is no deterrent to him. So despite everything else desperately going on at the moment that people want to spend money on, if our defence deterrent isn't up to it, it could all become irrelevant.
I mean, is there an argument to be made that we need to be going like the clappers to produce more military hardware, given that we're sending, rightfully so I would say, a lot over to our friends in Ukraine to try and push back the aggression of Moscow? Because when you look at the hardware we've got, we've had a sort of pretty tawdry history of things that just haven't been fit for purpose. We've had the Ajax tanks, I think it was, that was sort of breaking the spines of people riding in them. We've had aircraft carriers that don't seem to be able to get out of port very often. We've got our Trident missile plopping into the ocean after travelling all of about 100 feet. If I was sitting there in Moscow looking at what we're doing in the United Kingdom, we've also not got enough military personnel. We can't seem to recruit people who want to join the forces anymore. I'd think they look pretty weakened.
Well, that's right. This is the whole thing about focus on defence. It's only very recently that it's become a political issue and will be an issue in the next election that, is the first duty of government to provide a credible defence. And I think, things have changed with the Ukraine war. There's an awful lot of focus on Gaza and Israel at the moment, and Britain seems to be prepared to put boots on the ground there. And we've shot down Iranian missiles fired at Israeli civilians. But we seem unwilling to shoot down Russian missiles that have been fired at Ukraine or potentially put British boots on the ground in Ukraine, despite the fact that Putin has been telling us what he's doing. So having a credible defence is key. And I think our current defence setup was produced for a war that doesn't exist now and is not likely to exist. So those two aircraft carriers, 10 million quid's worth, whether they work or not is sort of irrelevant. They're not much use to hold the Russians back. So I think we do need to provide Ukraine with all the ammunition it needs, because if Ukraine can hold the Russians, it means that we don't have to put our boots on the ground to do it. But it's something that people really need to focus on, because actually, we're only hearing today that the US State Department have confirmed that the Russians are using chemical weapons extensively in Ukraine. And that's something that I've written about a lot. And the Ukrainians don't have gas masks. So, we should give them gas masks at least to be able to defend themselves. But yeah, this is an existential threat to this country. And therefore, our defence needs to be up to that requirement.
Shocking. I had no idea about the chemical weapons. That is brand new information to my ears, and pretty horrifying to learn that fact. It's interesting. What you were saying is sort of bordering on the sort of thing Emmanuel Macron is starting to say, which is we need to be in a position where we don't just listen to Putin's threats about, banging his fist on the table, and if a British person does anything, intercept a missile, whatever, we're going to flood you with the sort of create a tidal wave by a nuclear explosion under sea or whatever it is that Putin's claiming he can do. There's a very fine line here, isn't there, between sort of not wanting to provoke and then, bring upon yourself something utterly catastrophic, but also standing up to mad aggressors like Putin. Do you think we've reached the point now that simply arming Ukraine, simply sending over weapons is enough, or should we be looking to do more?
Well, we should certainly be planning to do more. I rarely agree with President Macron, but he's right here. tyrants like Putin only recognize strength and they exploit weakness. And I think the whole nuclear issue, he's threatened us with nuclear attack since day one of the invasion, nearly 2.5 years ago. And that has really, frightened some of the more timid leaders in Europe, and I think to the UK as well. But actually, that nuclear threats are completely hollow. It's something I've looked at in great detail. I don't think there's any way in the world Putin would fire a nuclear weapon at us or any other European country, because then his great desire to recreate the Soviet Union will be gone. So I think we do need to be more hard-nosed about this. We do need to help the Ukrainians, and we need to plan to fight the Russians if the Ukrainians don't prevail.
I remember when all of this kicked off, and I was one who sort of pointed out that Russia was probably going to invade Ukraine a long time before it happened, and everyone thought I was being a bit crazy and a bit left field in suggesting it. Then when it happened, we heard people say, well, they're going to grind into a lot of trouble. They're going to run out of weapons. These sanctions are so strict, they're going to run out of cash money. And it seems to me, every time you look at Russia, they're just going from strength to strength and beginning to be able to push back. Is there an end in sight without this escalating? Is there a point in time in which Russia's simply run out of troops, run out of weapons? Or are we sort of, waiting in vain for something that Putin has no intent on ever finishing until he gets his own way?
Well, we must not make the mistake of thinking that Putin is a rational person like ourselves. He's quite happy to throw people into the meat grinder. I mean, the UK MOD only earlier this week reckoned that 450,000 Russians have been killed in this attack, in this invasion. So let's not use any metrics that we think are reasonable. Putin will keep on going. His whole economy is turned to the war. His tractor factories are making tanks, and he doesn't care about his civilian casualties or even his military casualties. So he will only stop when Putin is at an end, I'm afraid. But it's all about strength. We must show strength. Otherwise, he'll exploit our weakness, and he'll keep going after Ukraine, if we let him. So sadly, this is something that we really must put all our efforts into. Otherwise, we will be fighting the Russians in Europe as we did the Nazis, over 75 years ago.
Wow, harrowing words indeed. But thank you so much for your insight, Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, OBE, former British Army Colonel.